In February 2018, the Working Papers in Applied Linguistics and TESOL had the great pleasure of interviewing Dr. Roy Lyster, the invited speaker for the Apple Lecture Series hosted by the Applied Linguistics and TESOL program at Teachers College. Dr. Roy Lyster is Emeritus Professor of Second Language Education in the Department of Integrated Studies Education at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. His research examines content-based language teaching and the effects of instructional interventions designed to counterbalance form-focused and content-based approaches. His research interests also include professional development and collaboration among teachers for the purpose of integrated language learning and biliteracy development. He was co-recipient with colleague Leila Ranta of the 1998 Paul Pimsleur Award for Research in Foreign Language Education and was presented the Robert Roy Award by the Canadian Association of Second Language Teachers in 2017. He was co-president, then president, of the Canadian Association of Applied Linguistics from 2004 to 2008. He is author of a module called Content-Based Language Teaching, published by Routledge in 2018, and 2 books, Learning and Teaching Languages Through Content, published by Benjamins in 2007, and Vers une approche intégrée and immersion, published by Les Éditions CEC in 2016. We hope you enjoy our interview with Dr. Roy Lyster.
In your paper titled Content-Based Language Teaching, Converging Concerns Across Divergent Contexts, you provided an overview of the diverse contexts in which content-based language teaching, CBLT, has been implemented. The research findings you cited drew attention to the decisive role of teachers in ensuring the success of CBLT. As you discussed how professional development might help teachers overcome challenges specific to the implementation of CBLT, what would you say are the biggest obstacles to implementing CBLT?
Okay, good question. Do we have a couple days? So I would say that the biggest obstacles have to do with the integration of language and content. Mm-hmm. We always say, these programs now are called in Europe CLIL, Content and Language Integrated Learning. And yet it remains very difficult to actually do that. And first of all, teachers need to know how to integrate language and content. And this is very difficult. Theoretically, the idea is that the more you focus on language, the deeper you'll be able to process the content. And that justifies integrating a language focus. It'll help you process the content more deeply. But it's very difficult to do that in practice because to do that, you need to be very language sensitive. You need to have a wealth of linguistic knowledge in addition to the content knowledge, and that's why it's an obstacle. So it's hard to know how to do that, and that's why they can benefit from training to do so. It's also very difficult and challenging to know exactly what language to integrate. Sometimes we think that, language and content, yes, they're impossible to separate. But actually, it's very difficult sometimes to identify the language features that are quite meaningful in a particular subject area. And it's difficult for teachers. Again, in some respects, they do need some linguistic knowledge. They could focus on academic functions, so hypothesizing and predicting and describing and explaining. So teachers can help students with the language they need to accomplish those functions. They can also focus on different text types or genres, so that they're looking at text types like what's the language needed, what's the structure of a science report versus an historical account, right? Not that that's easy for teachers, but that's something that I think we do at school, whether the learners are first language learners or second language learners. We teach about text types and academic functions. And I think what remains even more difficult is when the learners of content are second language users and they have grammatical issues. They need some grammatical information because it's very hard to find grammar that is really essential to express a certain content area. So for example, one could, if one's teaching history, one could decide to focus on past tense, okay, which would make a lot of sense. And some teachers that I've worked with, are doing that. But it's also difficult because we actually know that a lot of history lessons can be taught in the present tense by using the historical present. So it's not even a tense that imposes itself in history. And in fact, a lot of history texts are written using the present tense. So there's some work that teachers need to do in that regard. Other features of grammar that are less meaningful, especially in Romance languages. I'm involved with French, and so I often use grammatical gender as an example of a language feature that really has absolutely no meaning. So you could never say, we do it, but it'd be very hard to say, okay, I'm going to pick grammatical gender because it's just so meaningful in this history lesson. Like, it's not meaningful. So you have to contrive the focus a little bit, and these are all challenges for teachers, and they need linguistic support, they need some professional training because it doesn't really come naturally to them. And again, I just think of morphosyntax being difficult because it's not salient. A lot of grammar actually, contrary to what systemic functional linguists say, they say that grammar and meaning are just so intertwined. I think they might be thinking more of English, but when you think of a lot of Romance languages and many other languages, the morphosyntax is just redundant. It has no meaning at all, and that's why it's so difficult for learners to learn, and that's why I'm interested in helping teachers to focus on that so that students are really not only learning the content, but continue to develop higher levels of proficiency.
Thank you. Another question. Much research has been dedicated to investigating the use of content-based language teaching in primary and secondary schools. Do you think content-based language teaching should also be implemented in adult language instruction? If so, what might this look like?
Okay, so the short answer to that question is yes, I do. But I need to say that I'm a bit surprised by the question because there's actually a great deal of CBLT at the tertiary level. So that even here in the United States, some universities in so-called foreign language departments, in Italian, for example, at upper levels, at the undergraduate level, might be teaching Italian geography in Italian. So that they do the language courses maybe in the first 2 years, and then they do content courses in the upper years, and content courses could be literature, something related to literary studies, and people are considering that a type of content. But also, the target language is culture or geography. Also, what's growing exponentially in the world are programs that are called EMI programs at the post-secondary level. So EMI is English Medium Instruction. So all over Europe and elsewhere, universities are putting together more and more, not just courses being taught in English in non-English speaking countries, but entire programs offered in English as kind of an international or second language. And there's a huge literature about this. A lot of it focuses calls it EMI. Ernesto Macaro and his colleagues or students from Oxford just came out with one of those state-of-the-art articles in language teaching, 2017, on EMI. It's a really good update. And it's kind of problematic because a lot of these programs, you say, what would it look like? The problem at the tertiary level is that there doesn't seem to be a great focus on language per se. So in the case of EMI, these are often kind of managerial decisions made by university administrations to kind of increase the profile of the university, but without really thinking about enhancing students' English language development. But there's also another acronym in Europe. This is sometimes called Integrating Language and Content in Higher Education. So or integrating content and language. Let's say it's ICLHE, and it's an association, and they have conferences every 2 years. And there is some work in that area trying to really look at this in terms of cross-disciplinary collaboration, so that there are content teachers collaborating with language teachers. So that's one way of going, is through teacher collaboration. Another way of going is through what we call adjunct courses, so that students, one of the best examples actually is at the University of Ottawa in Canada, which has what they call an immersion program, but it's at the post-secondary level. And University of Ottawa is a bilingual university, so Anglophone students there can take some of their courses in French, for example, psychology courses, history courses, and they're taking them with other Francophones. The courses have been designed for first language speakers of French. The Anglophones attend these courses, and then for 1.5 hours per week, they go to their adjunct language course and get help with understanding the content and so on. And that's one model about how CBLT could look at the tertiary level. There's another. I have an MA student, Moriyoshi, who I guess a few years ago, did an MA study observing EMI university level courses in Japan. One of the classes was sociology, taught in English. I can't remember what the other one, geography or something like that, taught in English. And she observed, she was interested in looking at the extent to which teachers, instructors would focus on language. And basically found that they didn't really focus on language other than vocabulary. So there's a huge vocabulary focus. It was all about making the content comprehensible, so it was very input driven. And in fact, it was all designed really it was all lecture based. And in the end, she was able to quantify the language use by participants, and the instructors 93% of the utterances belong to the instructors, and 7% belong to the students. So there is a problem in these at the tertiary level that they can become very lecture oriented, which kind of goes against some of the principles that we found in immersion education and put forth by Swain about the importance of language production and language interaction. But the students in this particular Japanese study and the teachers felt that the courses were nonetheless enhancing their listening skills, which isn't a bad thing if that's the objective, and also enhancing their content knowledge, so that they were in actually learning the content. So there are pros and cons. There's a lot going on at the tertiary level. I also want to mention work by Laurent Camerata. He has a book from, I guess, last year, maybe 2016, published by Routledge, about content-based learning in the foreign language classroom. And he's really trying hard to encourage teachers to bring content into their foreign language classrooms at, I think it's primarily at the tertiary level, so that in a Spanish class they're not just practicing how to order food in a restaurant, but they're doing something more substantive and dealing with trying to become critical thinkers. So they're using the foreign language class as a place to become critical thinkers, think about issues, environmental issues or discrimination issues, and bring that into the program. So there's lots going on and lots of potential. And but most of my work, has been at the elementary level.
Thank you. So let's do the next question. So the counterbalance hypothesis that you proposed states that instructional activities and feedback that counter the communicative orientation of the lesson are more effective than those that are congruent with it. However, one of the aims of a communicative-oriented classroom, especially for adults, is to allow students to engage in interactional practices that they will use in everyday life outside of the classroom. In a way, making classroom discourse more conversational. How do we resolve this paradox?
Okay. So first of all, I don't really see it as a paradox at all because, well, first of all, I think that the evidence that an exclusive focus on communicative interaction without any focus on language, the evidence that that's effective is rather slim right now. Most of the research says that even in these programs that are focused on communicative interaction, you need to bring in some sort of focus on language, maybe just incidentally, in line with Long's idea of focus on form, for example. Also doing so is really in line with what we call transfer-appropriate processing. So in transfer-appropriate processing, the idea is that for learning to be successful, the context in which the learning occurs should resemble to some extent the context in which the learning will be put to use. Okay? So what this means is that if you're in a traditional classroom and you're studying grammar in fairly traditional ways, filling in blanks and so on, you'll learn how to do that, and you'll do well on the test and fill in the blanks, but you won't transfer that knowledge to other contexts. But if you're in a context of communicative interaction, and during that context you're having your attention drawn to language in meaningful ways, then you're going to be able to retrieve that and remember it better in subsequent contexts that involve similar types of communication. So I think there are lots of arguments for applying the counterbalance hypothesis even to a classroom that is more conversationally oriented. I think adult learners can benefit from meaningful focus on form during that interaction. That's basically what the SLA literature seems to be, and they would benefit more from that than nothing, and more from that than doing some traditional exercise out of context. So it's a perfect context to do some sort of focus on language in context.
Megan, what do you think are the most important takeaways language teachers should glean from empirical classroom research findings on CBLT?
Okay, so I go back to some of the original work that was done in the 80s on our French immersion programs and published by Swain and her colleagues. And I think one of the most very takeaways is that content teaching on its own is not good language teaching. She wrote that in 1988. The other takeaway, and related to that, is the fact that Krashen was wrong to say that the one way we acquire language is by comprehending messages in that language. That is not right, because what we know from research is that students can actually draw on all sorts of resources, contextual knowledge, to figure out the content and process the language semantically while bypassing the grammar. They're not picking up the grammar at the same time. So all of these arguments suggest that if you implement, and if you're teaching in a content-based program, you have to bring language into the picture because you cannot rely on students simply picking up the language from the input. They pick a lot of language up, so the good thing is you don't have to focus on absolutely everything. You have to figure out where the gaps are. Often they're in morphosyntax, but they might be somewhere else, and provide some language support. So that's the biggest takeaway, and this research has been around for decades. And I'm still surprised when I go into programs and they just don't think you have to use language. Somewhere on the internet, I think it says if you teach content, you don't have to teach language. And that's it.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you. So that sort of concludes the interview section on the content-based language teaching, and we're going to transition our focus to corrective feedback. So much of your research addresses the topic of oral corrective feedback, and I'm wondering what sparked your interest in this topic, and what has sustained your interest in it over the years?
Okay. Well, I started out as a French immersion teacher in 1982, and I think back then I started already to become interested only because my students just made so many errors. I couldn't believe it. They were in 8th grade. They'd been in the program so long. I'll never forget being terrified before I started teaching because, I'd done a master's in French literature. I lived in Paris for a few years, and I came back to Toronto, and I got this job after doing my teaching certificate. I got a job teaching students who had been in the program for 8 years, and I thought, my God, they've been in this program for 8 years. I was only in France for 3. They're going to know so much more than me. And then when I started and heard them speak, I thought, oh, okay, they don't know more than me, and I can help them. I need to help them. But at the same time, I started doing studies. I did another master's degree in studying applied linguistics at OISE, which is the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education in Toronto, and was reading, this was like 1985, I was reading Krashen's input hypothesis, and everything said, don't correct students. It'll just harm them. It'll raise the affective filter. It'll just cause tension, and plus it's not effective because we just know that the errors work themselves over time, just like in first language acquisition, we were told. And we were also told that, and besides, parents don't give their children any corrective feedback, which is, everyone who has a child, like, hello. So what they meant back then was that, parents don't say to their kids, come on, you got the wrong participle. Couldn't you do better than that? Like, they don't use meta-language and give explicit feedback, but there's a lot of recasting and elaboration going on. But anyway, I was teaching, 8th graders, and I thought, well, if corrective feedback is going to, cause anxiety, I'm not going to use any because there's already enough, certain level of tension with kids that age. But I found it hard to believe because the errors just weren't going away. It didn't seem like it was very logical. Anyway, then I started to do my PhD study, which wasn't about corrective feedback at all. It was an intervention study looking at the effects of instruction on sociolinguistic competence. But during my study, I observed teachers, and I'll never forget observing this one teacher that I quite liked. I liked the way he interacted with the students. And they were talking about the differences in politeness between like just a short note you might write to a friend and a letter, formal letter in French. So back then, it's probably the same in Spanish. Like you'd end a formal letter saying, I beg of you to accept my sincere gratitude for having taken your precious time to read my humble letter, something very formal like that. And so he said, what's the difference between a formal and an informal letter? And a student said, the thing at the bottom, which I thought was a pretty good answer, right? And he said, the thing at the bottom? And she said, oh, the final salutation. And I thought, well, that's cool. So she said this in French, la salutation finale. And I thought, well, that's so cool because she knew that the right term, but just needed to be pushed to use it, And then I thought, well, that makes a lot of sense. And then I linked it to Meryl Swain's work on pushed output. I thought, well, what is pushed output anyway? Like, how could we operationalize that? And so as soon as I got my job at McGill, at the same time, I was also interested in David Stern's work on analytic language teaching and integrating it into more experiential. That was his terminology, and he was talking a lot about the fact that immersion programs basically it's like saying they needed more form-focused instruction, whereas more traditional programs needed much more communicative stuff going on, right? And I became interested in that, like how in immersion, when you teach content, do these teachers focus on language? So this is the study that I started with Leila Ranta, and we did lots of videotaping, and at first we weren't just looking at corrective feedback, we just wanted to see how they focused on language. And we stumbled across feedback. It's like, they're giving a lot of feedback, so let's start looking at it. And what we found was, actually, they're giving a lot of feedback, but they're mainly just recasting, and it doesn't seem that helpful because the kids aren't repeating them, or there seems to be a lot of ambiguity. Mm-hmm. So I became really interested in looking at classroom interaction from that perspective, and then all of a sudden at the same time, or 1996, Long published his chapter about focus on form and how it was really about his updated hypothesis, interaction hypothesis, saying how useful recasts were and that how teachers should start really using them. This is how we focus on form. And it just contradicted our empirical results. It's like, well, first of all, teachers are already using recasts, so why would we suggest that they start using them? Second of all, there's no evidence that they're very effective in this context. But following his paper, there's all these lab studies showing recasts to be very effective. And so I just became more and more interested in trying to show that there are other types of feedback that might be more effective. And the other thing that kept my interest going was that the original group of teachers that we worked with were invited after our project to look at the results, about how they're giving feedback. And it was very interesting. I was kind of worried because I didn't want to appear too critical. I just showed them the results, and they just were blown away. They said, you know what? We have no idea how we interact with our students, and we're not focusing on language. We're just focusing on content. And we thank you very much for bringing our attention to this, because it's not something we thought about. And I found that very interesting and decided that I wanted to bring it to my career, or make my career useful by simply raising teachers' awareness of interactional patterns and corrective feedback. And that's what I've been doing ever since.
Well, thank you. My next question is one of those over-the-year kind of questions. So over the years, it seems like your perspective on how to provide beneficial feedback has changed. You appear to have shifted from recommending that teachers consider the whole range of techniques at their disposal. That was in your work with Leila Ranta in 1997, and then suggesting that teachers offer a balanced provision of both recasts and prompts in your work with Hiroti Hyde-Mori in 2006. To what appears to be maybe a different perspective in today's lecture, where you seem to advocate for contextualized practice over noticing of target forms. Can you tell us what led to this change?
Okay, so first of all, I just want to reframe it a bit and say that I actually don't think that my perspective on this has changed. The issue is that teachers' practices haven't changed. So initially when I realized that from our database and other people's databases, teachers were really overusing recasts, I thought, well, just use different corrective feedback types in a better, more effectively distributed way, rather than overusing only one type of feedback. And then in 2014, Brown's meta-analysis came out in language teaching research. And it's a meta-analysis of 28 studies. They're all observational studies of classrooms around the world, looking exactly at the same feedback types that Lyster and Ranta looked at, and he found the exact same distribution, so that teachers were still more than half the time using recasts. It was just identical. So I actually, I continue to suggest to teachers that probably the best way to go is to use a variety of feedback types, but if you're overusing one type of feedback, and I think they're underusing prompts, I think teachers still feel a little bit uncomfortable with that idea of pushing students, and so I really try hard to show them that it's effective and that it's not harmful, and that I really believe that it fits into an educational framework much more so than recasting. I see recasting as just kind of echoing and doing a lot of work for students, and I really think that good education pushes students forward, and it helps them. Students don't just need to notice errors they've made. They need to be pushed to retrieve and produce, so that they're consolidating knowledge that they've already acquired at some level. So it's about knowledge consolidation. So because I think teachers continue to underuse that type of feedback because they think it might be kind of awkward to do so, I try to push them in the other direction, saying this is actually a really good educational tool that can apply to any kind of feedback related to content, related to language, and it can be integrated into our teaching. So, and that's why I try to frame it as contextualized practice and not just feedback. It's part of a bigger picture.
Thank you.
So the next question taps into methodological issues. A considerable body of your work has examined naturally occurring classroom discourse as a way to understand corrective feedback. A research approach that has very high ecological validity. However, in Gu and Mackey, the case against recast, it is suggested that internal validity must take priority. And SLA researchers need to carefully control variables in order to identify the effects of corrective feedback. This seems to be a long-standing methodological issue in instructed SLA research. What are some possible ways to satisfy both ecological and internal validity when designing research on corrective feedback?
Okay. Well, first I just want to say that the Gu and Mackey paper is probably one of the worst papers that I've ever read. And I really encourage people to read our counterpoint piece as a response to it instead. It's full of contradictions and misrepresentations. But in terms of the validity issues, first of all, when it comes to, so one of their concerns was that we shouldn't compare recasts and prompts.
Apples and oranges. That's what they say. Apples and oranges. They call them apples and oranges.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And they say that, but they contradict themselves because the first part of the paper is how effective recasts actually are, and we in fact know that recasts do push students in their output. And then all of a sudden they say, well, it's not fair to compare them because recasts don't push students in their output and prompts do. So it's kind of a contradiction, but there are ways to control for output variables in classroom studies. So the best way to do it, you could contrive a study where, this isn't really what I recommend, but you could contrive a study where a recast group was getting recasts but you recast and then moved on and didn't allow them to produce output. And the prompt group, you could keep prompting until they actually push output. But produce modified output. But I think a better way of doing it is doing it more naturalistically, so that you're giving these different feedback types, and and then the output you measure by having video recorded or audio recorded the intervention, so that afterwards you can quantify the amount of output after each feedback type and simply bring it into the analysis as a variable. It would be, in fact, I think it's a very important study. We need to know. There's some evidence there's some suggestion that it's not important for learners to repeat recasts. It would be good to know that. I'm not sure if that's the case at a younger level. There's some evidence in lab studies. So I think it'd be interesting to continue to look at that. The problem with their article is that they're just so adamant. You can only do this study and you can't compare it. And what's funny is that they only started saying we shouldn't compare recasts and prompts after the research came out showing prompts to be more effective, because prior to that they were saying we need more research comparing these types of feedback. And then the other issue that I really think is problematic is when they suggest that instruction is a confounding variable in all of this, because they're saying that classroom studies that focus on the effectiveness of feedback, that also have a form-focused instructional component, are introducing a confounding variable. And so you should just have a study that's purely looking at feedback, which is absurd, because the way that feedback has to be considered is as an intrinsic part of the instructional process. So it does have internal validity, and it certainly has ecological validity. And there are ways of controlling for that. We've done it in our research. My study in 2004 had 4 different groups. 3 of them were treatment groups. So 3 groups got form-focused instruction. One of those groups got recasts, and one of those groups got prompts, and one of those groups got no feedback. But the form-focused instruction levels the playing field for all 3 groups, so they have access to the same knowledge. And if there are any benefits for the feedback groups, we know it's because of the feedback and not because of the instruction, because it was a group receiving instruction. In addition to that, we had another comparison group that did not get the same instruction, did not get form-focused instruction, just got the same content instruction and no feedback. So all the variables are controlled, And from a classroom perspective, these have internal validity and also external validity. So,
No, but yeah, it's nice to hear both sides.
yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
So my question is, the field of second language assessment also researches corrective feedback from a standpoint of classroom-based assessment, things like instructor, peer, self-assessment. Do you have recommendations on ways in which the field of second language acquisition and second language assessment could collaborate in order to more effectively further research in this area in both fields?
Yeah, this is such an interesting topic. I find it quite fascinating, and I really wish that I had some concrete recommendations. And I don't, apart from the fact, I just want to say that in 2013, Jim Papor from here and with our colleague, Carolyn Turner from McGill University, organized a colloquium at AAAL. It was in 2013, I think. On this topic. It was really nicely titled Learner-Oriented Assessment in Classrooms, a place where SLA, interaction, and language assessment interface, right? Mm-hmm. So I was kind of excited about this, and I think a lot of us were. And I presented on corrective feedback, and that's where I was able to learn a lot about learner-oriented assessment, and just thought, well, yeah, this is where feedback should be. And what I came to appreciate was seeing feedback not just as giving information to students, but feedback as a way to give students the means to change, the means to move forward. Mm-hmm. And I think that is where SLA and the assessment communities can connect, because I think SLA is interested in how does feedback provide learners with the means to improve or to enhance their language development. And I also think that for this research to be relevant, it needs to be very educationally oriented and classroom-based and educationally oriented, and not so much theoretically oriented in terms of, are they noticing recasts? And I actually think this is where prompts come in, because I think that prompts are very didactic in their function, very educational. And I think that if we want, as far as assessment goes, the idea of teachers prompting learners to see if they can retrieve and produce what they were supposed to have learned is absolutely ideal. And so I think there's a real connection in learner-oriented assessment and this idea of prompting to see not only, to see on the fly, in the moment, in terms of formative assessment, how well students are doing.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. So we've already touched upon this a little bit, but I'll ask it anyway. The findings of your paper, titled Oral Feedback in the Classroom, SLA, a Meta-Analysis, suggest that certain types of oral corrective feedback are more beneficial than others. What components of corrective feedback do you think contribute to their effectiveness or lack thereof?
Okay, so in terms of recasts, when they are effective, I believe they are effective mainly because of the positive evidence that they provide, and their effectiveness can be enhanced by shortness and intonation. So it's input features that make recasts effective. And when they're not effective, I think it's because they're not providing negative evidence. The learner is left to his own devices to infer negative evidence, okay? And we have a lot of observational data and with young learners where they're just not noticing, they're not inferring the negative evidence. So in the case of prompts, when they are effective, it's because they do provide negative evidence. If they're not effective, it's because the negative evidence wasn't salient enough. And their effectiveness comes not just from the learners noticing the negative evidence, but from having to retrieve and produce the language form. I just think retrieval and production is key here. If learners repeat after recast, they are also producing, but it's a different level of retrieval. It's just repetition, and so it doesn't entail the same depth of processing as prompting does. And I think it's the depth of processing that's associated with prompting that leads to their effectiveness.
And the last question for the interview and wrapping up our section on corrective feedback is actually several questions in one.
Okay.
So you acknowledge that despite the positive results of empirical research, teachers face challenges to providing corrective feedback to students. To what challenges are you referring? What are ways teachers can overcome these challenges? And for this last question, I'm wearing my teacher-educator hat. On a more concrete level, do you have suggestions on how to teach novice teachers to provide oral corrective feedback to their students?
Okay. And the first part of the question was again?
Sure. Basically, the challenges that teachers face providing corrective feedback.
Yeah. So I think the challenges that teachers face are related to the fact that this is part of a reactive approach. So it's done relatively spontaneously, and they have to make decisions on the spot. And those decisions need to be well informed, and they have to take into account the nature of the error. They have to take into account the appropriateness at that point in time of different types of feedback. They have to take into account the actual instructional context and the relevance of feedback in that particular context. And then they have to take in a range of individual differences concerning the child or children or student involved. So at some level, there's a lot of decision. And the first decision is, well, maybe I won't even give feedback, which is a perfectly acceptable decision, because the point is never to correct everything, right? We have to be clear on that. So you really have to make decisions about what's worth correcting. And normally I say, well, it should be connected to something that you're already working on. The focus, it has to be part of one of your linguistic objectives at that point in time, or just something the student really should know and needs help with, and so on. So those are the challenges. So I'm really interested in the teacher education aspect of it too. When I first started in this research, I wondered very much, well, so are these strategies things that can be taught, or is it just all part of our personality? I was very interested in that. And so after years, because I'm in teacher education too, I can say that, yeah, these are perfectly teachable. And I've done so many workshops with teachers, like those other teachers I mentioned that were in our original study, that just said, well, thanks, I wasn't really aware of what I was doing. And so just talking about the 6 different types of feedback gives teachers, it just increases their awareness. So it's hard for us to affect their behavior, but we can enhance their awareness, and then they make decisions based on the context they end up teaching in. So with pre-service teachers, I focus a lot on getting them to know the different types of feedback, and I also get them to code different data sets. So they're identifying the different types of feedback, and then we discuss that. And then I also have them make, they pair up with somebody and they produce a video that involves a scenario where, several scenarios where they have to actually enact each type of feedback. Each time using a different learner error, and that's been very helpful. They enjoy doing that kind of thing, and I was really quite impressed that they were really able to show their ability to enact these different feedback types. So that's what I've done with pre-service teachers. And of course with in-service teachers, I usually encourage them to video record themselves if they can, and transcribe that data and analyze their own interaction with students, identifying different feedback types and its outcomes. I always like to refer to a study by Vasquez and Harvey that appeared in Language Teaching Research, which was done in an SLA course, an MA level SLA course. And the focus of this course was on corrective feedback. So they started out by looking at some of the literature, they looked at the Lyster and Ranta paper, and then in small groups they chose one of the persons, had to be a teacher, so they actually video recorded the teacher, and then had to transcribe the data, code it in terms of feedback and uptake. At the same time, they had to keep journals about what they were learning in the course and so on. And what was interesting about this study was that the changes that it affected in teachers' behavior, or at least perceptions of feedback. Because a lot of the teachers started out the course saying, "Ooh, feedback, kind of awkward. Don't want to interrupt anybody. Not a good idea." And by the end of the course, they were saying, "Oh, well, yeah, I think we're going to have to give feedback. We have to be clear about language, and it's going to be very helpful for them, and we should do this." So that's something that I've done a lot with graduate level students. I'm very convinced of this because I have a lot of graduate students that have said, "Oh, after taking your course, I changed my whole feedback behavior," and the students love it, because they can really engage. There's something very motivating. That's why we have to do away with the myth that there might be something demotivating about feedback. We have these old ideas of error correction and being, made fun of or something. But it's actually very motivating to know that your teacher's on side and peers can give feedback, and you're all kind of in this game together learning language. There's something very positive about it if you're giving the right type of feedback. And that's what I like about these 6 different feedback types, is that there's a range and they're not interruptive, and they're just part of a good instructional process.
Thank you. Very helpful. I appreciate it.
Great.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for taking the time. We look forward to hearing more on these topics in today's lectures.
You will.
Yes. Very exciting stuff. So thank you again.
Okay, my pleasure. Thank you.